Welcome to episode 7 of the Learning React in 2021 series. In this one, we're going to talk about another hook, so our second hook in the series, the effect hook. Now, this one has to do with side effects. So what are side effects? A pure function in JavaScript is anything that is deterministic. If you give it the same input, you'll get the same output. And it also means that it doesn't affect things that are outside of its scope. So you wouldn't set a timer or do a fetch call inside of a pure function. That's what we're aiming to do with React. We have our component, which is a function. We can start with state, set that up. We can deal with our props, and we want to do the rendering. And that's going to happen with the same props. We're going to end up with the same rendered content every time. After the render happens, that's when we can do things like useEffect, where we can set a timer to run. We can do a fetch call. We can update the state. All these kinds of things. Local storage, geolocation, IndexedDB. Anything that is sort of out of that initial flow of the render. This is what useEffect is for letting these things happen after the render. And then we can also hook into state and say, you know what? When this thing, well, I want to watch this piece of state, and when it updates, that's also going to be a trigger to re-render stuff, so that's going to be a trigger for me to run this function. All right, so we've got the GitHub repo. We're on branch 7 here, so if we jump down to branch 7, this is the one that's going to have the finished code for this exercise. I've got our site up and running, the same thing that we had from before. Oh, actually, I disconnected it, so I'll restart this. In the code, so while this is up and starting, in the code, I did add a little bit of CSS. So I've updated app.css, I've updated header.css, and the search bar.css. Basically, I just shifted the header up to the top, got rid of that gap. I put a little bit of a shadow on the top, and I created some CSS for this area right here. Inside of app.js, I put a main element wrapped around this and added a little bit of CSS to that. Nothing critical, nothing that's going to affect what we're going to do. It's just purely visual stuff that I did. Inside app.js, I added the main element with this class name, and that CSS is inside of app.css. I just wrapped it around the search history element that we already had, so that component was already there. I just added the main. Okay, so useEffect. If I want to use this hook, just like useState and any of the other hooks, I have to import it. So we can say useEffect. Now that's brought in, so we have that function available to us. We can, inside of here, say useEffect. useEffect is going to take a function, and there'll be a second parameter. If this is empty, you're saying there's nothing that I really want to watch. There's nothing that I need to pay attention to and make this function run again if things inside of this watch array get updated. So with this inside of here, if I were to just add a console.log, this is the initial render. All right, so I save that. All we've done is import this, and I've added this function, useEffect. Back over here, there it is, initial render complete. When app.js, when the app component is finished rendering, that's when this function runs. Every time I refresh the page, I will get that message, the initial render is complete. Okay, so I know it runs on initial render. What else do I want to do here? Well, I'm going to make a call to the Star Wars API. I've got the link here. I'll post this link down in the description for you. I'm going to use the Star Wars API, and I'm just going to retrieve a list of the films. So I'm going to use this URL. We're going to make that happen when we first load, and then I'm going to take the result of that, and I'm going to put it into a state variable. So I'm going to use useState for the films. Right here, same as what we did with our useState for the history, the terms. We're going to say films, and set films. So films is going to be our array of all the data that comes back from the fetch call. Films is the method that we call if we want to replace or update that. And we need to update it because our initial value for this is going to be an empty array. At the start, there are no films. We have not made a fetch call yet. And I can't make a fetch call until after the initial render. So down inside of here, I've got search history. I'm going to create a component that is going to take those initial films and render them as a list, similar to what the search history did. So I'm going to put search results, we'll call this, and films equals films. Just keep the variable names all the same. So we'll create this component. We need to create a folder. We need to create the JavaScript and the CSS file. So we'll start off with that inside of component, search results. Inside of that, we'll have our search results.js, and we'll have our search results.css. Nothing inside of search results CSS yet. Inside of here, we'll import the CSS file and do our export default function search results. We'll accept props. Props is going to give us that films. We're going to build a UL, and inside of that, we're going to loop through whatever is passed through films. So right here, films, this prop, that's going to be an array that we pass down into here. The initial value, like we set up here, is an empty array. So we're going to be passing an empty array to here. And we may as well put the import here for the component. There we are. So we've got search results, and over here in search results, we're going to build our list. And we're building list items. Inside, we're going to have film dot. Now, I know the data here. I actually have over here. I'll just copy and paste it in. This is the data that we would get back. So one of the film objects, there's characters created, director edited, episode ID. I'm going to use episode ID as my key, and I'm going to get title right here. That's what I'm going to put in as the text inside the list item. So film.title, and then my key is going to be film.episode ID. All right, so we have our search results, which is going to come up as an empty array. So there's not going to be anything inside of there, but we will have this. And I'm going to add inside of here, just so I can target it, and I'll call it results. There we are. In the search results, we'll set this up. Now this is going to be one of our flex elements. This was the new CSS that I created inside of app.css. There was the content section. This was the new bit that I created, and it's display flex. So we've got our search history and the search results. We'll make them each sort of a third of the page for now anyway. So I'm going to set flex basis at 33%. Just enough to get us going. All right, so we have the class name on the UL. We've got this being rendered back up to app where we were loading this. We have not called set films anywhere. useState gives films an empty array. useEffect is going to write this out, and we're passing films into there. So if we take a look over here in the browser, let's refresh this, get rid of all that. We're not calling set films. We expected to see that. There's nothing being rendered here. there is no search results because we haven't made the fetch call yet. So that's what we're going to do. That's the purpose behind our functions here, the useEffect. So we have useEffect, and I'm going to create a new function here. I'm going to make it an asynchronous function, and I want to fetch data. What kind of data do I want to get? I want to get films. So I'm going to call this from inside of here. We will say fetch data films. That's going to call this function. If we look at the API here, we'll see swappy.dev/API/films. This is going to be the URL that we want. So I'm going to copy that, and we're going to append the type on the end of that. Inside of here, we'll say let URL equal this, and we'll insert type right on the end. So that's the URL that we want to fetch. This is asynchronous. We're going to be doing this from useEffect. useEffect runs after the render is complete. So we're not going to be in a race condition with the rendering and then getting into problems where it's trying to do two things at the same time and they start conflicting. We want to do this after the initial render. When this is complete, that's when we will call setFilms, and we're going to provide the new data here. So we're going to call this in just a moment. We want to do a fetch of our URL. And because this is asynchronous, I can break this up into steps. We can say let response equals await that. When we've got it back, we can check. If not response.ok, I will throw an error. And we'll take our response.status text. Standard stuff for the fetch. Then I'm going to get the data that I want to pass over to setFilms. We need to await because we're going to call the response.json method. And then here, this is where I want to pass in the data, but it's not the entire object. It is the results array. If we look in the Star Wars API, we'll see that there is the entire object that we get back from JSON, but results is the array with the array of films. So here, setFilms is going to replace whatever was there before with a brand new array. Now, having done that means that we have updated films. When films gets updated, that will trigger a re-render, which means right here we're using it, search results is going to get re-rendered. So we should see, there they are. Here are the films. So the initial render complete. Let's refresh and start over again. So the initial render was complete, and then we're not seeing the initial render message again, even though we did get a re-render. This was only for the initial render. To see what I mean about the initial versus re-rendering, I'm going to jump down into this component here, the search results component. If we go inside of here, I can use useEffect in here as well. So we need to import it. There we are. We've got useEffect. We can use it. And I'm going to add it here. I'm going to give you an example of using it where you are actually tracking something. I'm going to put it in here twice. You can actually use the useEffect method as many times as you want. So remember, there's a function and then the array. If the array is empty, this only runs for the initial render. If you put something inside of here, for example, instead of props, I'm passing in a thing called films. That's what we're looping through right here. I'm saying anytime there's a change to this, that's when I want to run this method. So here, for this component, it's the initial render of the component only. And for this one, Okay, so we've got one for initial and re-render. This one we should see once. This one we'll see for the initial render, as well as when the films actually got loaded, when props.films changed from an empty array into a full-fledged array. And there we are. There's the initial render for app.js. Here's the initial render only for films. And here's the initial and the re-render of films. So it happened twice. There we go. Initial render of films, initial render of app.js, initial and re-render of films, initial and re-render of films. So this one right here happened when the array was an empty array. This one happened after we updated and we actually provided an array of film titles that could be rendered like this. So useEffect and useState, these are the two most common hooks. These are the ones that you're going to see again and again throughout your development of your React application. You're going to use them all the time. These are really what give us access to state and the component lifecycle. useEffect is the component lifecycle. So it used to be that you would have a render method. Instead of just the return, there'd be a render method. That's part of the lifecycle. And then there's the component did mount, component did update. So did mount is right after the initial load. That's like what we're doing here. And then component did update is tracking something. There was a change and we re-render the component. We're doing it here. The difference with these ones is that with useEffect, I can specifically target which properties that I want to use as triggers for my running of the function. It's not just, oh yeah, the thing re-rendered. It's, no, this property changed to cause a re-render. So under different circumstances, we can look at different properties and say, that's the reason that I'm currently re-rendering this thing. And then we can do logic that is specific to that. Back here in the app, we're looking at having a function that will do a fetch. Now, right now we've got it, we're using films. We've kind of got it a little bit flexible, but we're going to, in the future, start working with some of the other hooks, and we're going to look at some of the routing that we can do by clicking on the links, and we're going to use that data to decide which fetch call we're going to make and which data we're going to bring back. And then we're going to be updating the data and passing information down to search results to say, no, it's not just films. It could be people. It could be films. It could be planets or vehicles or whatever it is. And then do things appropriate to whatever it is that we're getting back. All right. So that is useEffect. And combining that with useState, you've got a lot of power at your fingertips now. So I hope this all makes sense. Have a go, play around with it. Just be careful that useEffect is being used inside of your function. It's not something that you can take, like useState. We can't take those things and put them outside the function and use them and expect things to happen properly. Don't try and make useEffect into an asynchronous function. That's not allowed. I could put another function inside of here that was asynchronous, like this one. I could place this inside of here. However, if you are inside of useEffect calling this, you can get into a loop situation where it is calling itself again and again and again because it's updating the data, and that's going to be a trigger for the calling the fetch again, and you can get into a loop situation. So just be careful about that. All right, so any questions about useEffect, feel free to leave those in the comments down below. I'll answer as many as I have time for. And as always, thanks for watching.